This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode 54.
Welcome to the 54th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from FertilityFriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. If you've been enjoying the show, I would love it if you would take a moment and leave a review and a rating on iTunes. It helps the show to move up in rankings so that more people can find it. And I would like to say a special thank you to all the listeners who've left reviews already. I read all of your reviews and I really appreciate you taking the time to let me know how I'm doing. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please stop by the show notes page and leave a comment. You'll find all the episodes at fertilityfriday.com/podcast. And you can also find me on Facebook at facebook.com/fertilityfridays with an S and on Twitter at fertilefriday. And as many of you know, I've recently created the Fertility Friday Facebook group. And so if you're interested in learning more about the fertility awareness method in a supportive community, just head over to fertilityfriday.com/community and you'll be redirected to the group. And in today's show, I'm very excited to welcome my guest, Dianne Keddy. Dianne is a registered dietitian nutritionist in Newport Beach, California, and she specializes in nutritional counseling for compulsive overeating, binge eating, weight management, diabetes, food allergies, the MTHFR gene mutation, methylation defects, as well as numerous other medical concerns. Dianne has her Bachelor of Science in Clinical Nutrition and her Master's in Nutritional Science as well. And she has a specialized certification in treating eating disorders, as well as a certification in food allergies. So she has a wealth of information to share with us today. And in today's show, we'll be talking about the MTHFR gene mutation and how it can impact a woman's health and fertility. I get so many questions about this gene mutation, and I find that it's one of those things that everyone needs to know about, even if it doesn't affect you directly. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Dianne.
Thank you, Lisa.
Well, thank you so much for being here. So before we get into it, I'd love to just hear a little bit about your background and why you ended up focusing a pretty significant part of your practice in this area, the methylation defects.
Well, nutrigenomics has actually been around for about 20 years, and I've always been interested in it. It tends to focus on biochemistry, which was a strong interest of mine in school. And we really haven't had the technology until recently to do anything with the information. So I've been waiting for the technology to catch up, and it's done that in about the last 2 years. But actually, the reason I became specifically interested in MTHFR is I found out that I have the mutation.
Oh.
So that triggered my desire to learn more about it. So I've been studying it now for about 2 years. And then I started having clients come in who also were being tested for it, and they were testing positive. And so even prior to me finding out I had it, my clients had it. And so I was already researching what it is, how to treat it, what does it mean. So this has been on my radar for over 2 years. But yeah, so first it was to help my clients, and then I got tested and tested positive. And then, of course, my own interest fueled it even more.
Well, and how did you find out you had it, or what sparked you to get tested for it?
I was having some of the symptoms associated with it, and I asked my physician to test me, and he did, and it came back positive.
Okay, then let's get right into it. What is MTHFR? What is it? What does it stand for?
Okay, that's always the first hurdle to get past is the wording. So we generally use the acronym rather than the full name. The full name, though, is actually methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase. And it's actually a gene, and it's also an enzyme. So you have the gene that codes for whether or not you have the enzyme that works properly. And then the enzyme converts homocysteine to methionine in the methylation cycle. And then methionine makes glutathione, which is one of the major detoxifiers for the body. And then the MTHFR enzyme converts folic acid into the usable form, which is methylfolate, which then drives the methylation cycle. So those are the two main things the enzyme does, is it converts homocysteine, and it also converts folic acid into methylfolate. And those are really the two big things that the MTHFR enzyme does, and that's why you want it to work properly, so that your body can make the conversions and so that you can detoxify in the body.
Okay, so with MTHFR, which I'm much more comfortable saying, by the way.
Yes, please.
Oh
Please
my
use
goodness.
that, not the name, yes.
But with MTHFR, it becomes a problem when you have a mutation in the gene. So when the gene is operating, optimally function properly, when you don't have the defect, what exactly is it doing?
What it should be doing, and what it does do when it's working, is it takes homocysteine, which is a byproduct of metabolism, and it converts it to methionine. And then methionine makes glutathione, which is really important because it detoxifies heavy metals, pesticides, toxins, anything that your body needs to get rid of. Glutathione helps process. So you need to have glutathione in order to have a healthy body. And then the second function of the enzyme is converting folic acid, which is in our food and in our supplements that we take, into the usable form, which is methylfolate. Because your body actually can't do anything with folic acid, it has to be converted. And if you don't have the enzyme working properly, you have either decreased conversion or sometimes very little at all, depending on what mutations you have.
Okay. So obviously it plays a really important role in our bodies.
It does.
And so then when you have this defect, so is it a genetic defect?
Yes, it's a gene, and you either have it or you don't. I mean, you either have the mutation or you don't. So either your gene is normal or there's different combinations of different mutations you can have.
Okay. And so then when it is not functioning properly, maybe you could talk a little bit about that and what havoc it wreaks or it can wreak in your body.
Yes, that depends on which mutation you have, but some of the symptoms are things like repeated miscarriages, blood clots, heart disease or strokes, especially at an early age, like people that get them in their 40s or 50s. It can also cause depression, fibromyalgia, migraines, cancer, chronic fatigue syndrome, birth defects, depression, anxiety. So there are many different things in the body that can malfunction if you have the gene.
That's a huge range of symptoms and of medical
Mhm.
conditions that can be caused by it. So does it have like a direct effect on it or more of an indirect?
Well, there's if you go into to Medline, which is the government database for research, and if you put in MTHFR mutation, over 5,000 research articles will come up. So this has been researched for at least the last 10 years, and it's increasing because now that the awareness is out there, there's lots of research going on. So we're kind of in the beginning stages of fully understanding it. But the way it links back to these specific symptoms is when you look at the pathway biochemically, the MTHFR enzyme is directly involved in the pathways for you to have normal functioning in these areas.
Okay. Well, how common is this? So what percentage of the population is affected by this gene mutation?
Actually, it varies depending on ethnic group, but it's somewhere between 50 to 85% of the population has some type of mutation. So it's more prevalent in Asians and it's more prevalent in Hispanics. So the numbers would be higher. But basically, about 10% of the population has the homozygous mutation for C677. And then the other mutation is less common. So mostly you're looking at people that have what's called C677 as having most of the physical ailments. And then people that have 1298 are more prone to depression and having more of the depression and the mood issues.
Okay, and for the listeners who are not geneticists, when you say homozygous,
Sorry, that means two mutations. So 677, most of the people I see in my practice coming in have two mutations in that one, meaning that their gene is completely abnormal. So the function of the enzyme is greatly reduced.
okay. So is this like back to science class where you get like one part of something from your mom and one
Yes,
part of something from your dad? And if you have
yes,
one, it would work a certain way. And if you have both, so if a person has both from both parents, then it impairs the gene function more than if you only have it from one parent?
correct. If you have two mutations, it reduces the enzyme by about 70%, the enzyme's ability to function by about 70%.
Okay, so that's if you have it from both parents. And then if you have it from one parent,
It's about 40% loss of function.
okay. And so this is directly related to our body's ability, like you said, to process homocysteine, to methionine, to glutathione, and to process folic acid to folate. Does it impact any other types of processes, or are those the main ones?
Those are the main ones. There's more things that go on with folate, but those are the kind of the overview of what it does.
Okay. A lot of what I focus on the podcast is fertility, and a lot of my listeners are trying to conceive or even just learning how their menstrual cycle can show different signs of various health concerns and those types of things. So a lot of people who've listened to the podcast have learned just the different ways that these things can impact her health. So when a woman is trying to conceive, how does this gene mutation impact her chances of successfully doing so and having healthy babies?
What happens is if the woman has the mutation, it can cause the homocysteine levels to be high because it's not breaking down to methionine. And so that you can end up with blood clots either in the placenta or once the woman is pregnant in the fetus, and then that can cause miscarriage. So repeated miscarriages is a red flag for MTHFR gene mutation. And I think most reproductive doctors nowadays test for it.
Okay. Do they test for it right off the bat if a woman's having difficulty, or is it more of a flag like once they've had those miscarriages?
Unfortunately, it typically isn't tested for until they've had at least 1 or 2 miscarriages.
Okay. And is this something in your experience with your clients that you could go to your doctor and just say, you know what, I have a concern, can I get tested for this? Or are doctors more hesitant to do that proactive type of screening?
It depends on the doctor. Some of them really minimize this as an issue, and then others are more read the current research and they really see it as an issue. I think it depends on the physician, but you can also test yourself. There are online testing services where you can order the test yourself. So I encourage people that have a family history of women in the family who have infertility, people that have polycystic ovarian syndrome, or just have had a lot of miscarriages either in their family or for themselves, to go ahead and ask the doctor. Most doctors order it. It may or may not be covered by insurance, but you can also go through 23andMe and it's included in their profile.
Okay. And you said 23
And me.
Emmy. So that's a link that I can link to for the podcast.
Yes.
I just haven't heard of it before.
Oh, it's been around for a while. It's an online genetic testing service. They have a big lab in Los Angeles where they send you a test kit and you spit into a tube. You send it back. It takes about a month to get your results, and they tell you they look at about 600,000 of your SNPs, and then you have to use a program to analyze it, and usually meet with a health professional to really understand the results. But one of the genes they test for is the MTHFR, both C677 and 1298. Plus, there's other lesser MTHFR genes they also test for.
Okay, and it's called 23andMe.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And the website is 23andme.com.
All right, so I will find that, and I will link to it on the show notes page. So for any of the listeners who are listening on the go, you don't have to worry about trying to remember that or writing it down or anything like that. So then let's talk a little bit more about miscarriage. So you mentioned if you have this gene mutation, your body is not breaking down the homocysteine, and therefore that can lead to blood clots. But also, so of course we're going to get into this folic acid thing a lot more as we talk. But, we all know as women, in North American society that we're always told, even you hear it when you're a kid, that if you want to get pregnant, you need to start taking your folic acid. So the fact that your body then, if you have this mutation, has an impaired ability to break down folic acid and change it into the usable form, does that increase the chance of birth defect, and does that have anything to do with the repeated miscarriages?
Yes, it does. If you're not making methylfolate because you have the gene mutation and your body cannot use the folic acid that you're consuming, it does increase the risk of neural tube defects in the child rather. And especially if there's any family history, that's a red flag for me. So when I do family histories, I'll say, has anyone in your family had any birth defects? And things like cleft palate, spina bifida, any kind of birth defect like that is usually from a folate deficiency, from methylfolate deficiency specifically.
Okay, and so then what happens, because one of the articles that you wrote that I'll link to in the show notes page is called "Is Folic Acid Poison to Pregnant Women?" So that's a pretty significant title. I love that title because it really just catches your eye. Like, how could folic acid be poison because we're always told to take it? So what does folic acid do to the woman who has this gene mutation to some degree, whatever it is, whether it's the homozygous from both parents or from either? What does that do to her when she's taking all this folic acid?
Well, there's two things. First thing is, if you can't break it down, you build up a pool of what's called unmetabolized folic acid. And this applies to anybody, whether they're pregnant or not. So if you have this mutation and you take a bunch of folic acid, or you eat a lot of grains in our country, which are now enriched with folic acid, you get a buildup of folic acid. And there's some research that shows that high levels of folic acid actually may increase the risk of colon cancer.
Wow.
So, they're just starting to research that, but certainly we're thinking it's not benign to have a bunch of folic acid in your body that shouldn't be there. And then the second issue, which is even more important, is that you can't make methylfolate, because the way it works is folic acid is supposed to be converted to methylfolate by the MTHFR enzyme. So if you have the MTHFR gene mutation, your enzyme doesn't work properly. So you're not getting that conversion from folic acid into methylfolate. And you need the methylfolate for cell division, growth, detoxification. I mean, it does so many things in the body, and it's turns on and off DNA. So if you don't have the methylfolate when you're pregnant, then you get the birth defects, all kinds of things. I mean, we're just starting to find out, maybe does it turn on genes in the baby that are, unhealthy, like for autoimmune illness, things like that. So you really have to have folate in the mother's body to have a healthy pregnancy. And if you have the folic acid that you're taking with the gene mutation, you're not getting the folate.
So then, for women who have this mutation and don't know, then they think they're doing the best thing for themselves and their baby by taking regular, because every prenatal vitamin has some version of folic acid, or if you're fortunate enough to get a high quality prenatal vitamin that actually has the methylated folate. But we're all, if you're trying to get pregnant, if you are pregnant, most women are just following the doctor's orders and making sure to take that folic acid, not knowing that it can actually be harming them.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes, that's correct. And that's unfortunate. And some OBs are up on this and some aren't. I think in about 5 more years, they'll all be up on it, and everybody will be recommending methylfolate consistently. But right now, it's just not something that's in the mainstream medical literature. It's more in the nutrition literature, and then more like the functional medicine literature.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned something interesting that I hadn't heard before. You mentioned that if a woman's eating lots of greens, some of the greens are now fortified with folic acid. Could you?
Yes, grains like bread, crackers,
grains.
pastas, grains. Yeah,
Okay.
grains, not greens.
I misheard
Greens
you.
are good. Greens are good. Fortified grains are not good. And actually, one of the recommendations I give my clients who have this mutation is that they eat a gluten-free diet, because anything in our country that has gluten in it also has been fortified with folic acid.
Wow.
They're processed foods. Okay, so that means I tell them, read labels, and even if it's something else like a protein bar, don't eat it if there's folic acid added to it. Don't consume a beverage if it's vitamin fortified and there's folic acid in it. And don't drink almond milk that has folic acid in it. So I tell them to read labels and really avoid as much folic acid as they can that's added to food.
That's huge, because gluten obviously is everywhere. So wheat products are everywhere. And so I'm guessing, after what you just said, that you probably couldn't find a wheat product that doesn't have folic acid in it.
And not unless it's gluten-free. Yeah, correct. And gluten-free by definition has no wheat. No, that's by law. It has to be enriched. There's a mandate in the U.S. that anything that's made with wheat, that's a processed grain product, if they add iron, riboflavin, thiamine, niacin, they fortify the food to make it healthier, supposedly, for the population. But when they did this years ago, MTHFR really wasn't being talked about. And they don't realize that by fortifying the foods, it's actually potentially harming part of the population.
Wow. So if a woman finds out that she has this gene mutation, then you said that your recommendation is actually to avoid all gluten, just because it's all fortified with folic acid, in addition to looking at other foods that may also be fortified. That's incredible.
Yes, and it is kind of a restrictive diet. However, our recommendations for good health are to minimize processed food anyway, and it's only found generally in processed food. So whole, fresh foods like apples, meats, cheese, and things like that don't have folic acid naturally occurring in them.
Okay.
It's folate that occurs in food. It's folic acid that is added to, that's man-made, and it's added to processed food.
Okay. Well, maybe we can just expand on that a little bit, and you could talk a little bit more about where we can find folate naturally occurring in food and how we can get that in our diet, especially if we happen to have that gene mutation.
Okay, so folate is naturally occurring in beans, lentils, spinach has a high amount, asparagus has a high amount, romaine lettuce, avocados, and broccoli.
Okay.
But let me give this disclaimer. I don't recommend that if you're trying to get pregnant that you only get folate in foods, because you have to eat a lot of these foods. For example, to get folate in beans, it's 200 micrograms per cup. And the recommendation for pregnancy is 600 micrograms up to 1,000 a day. So you're eating either a lot of beans and lentils, which are 200 micrograms of folate per cup, or for example, spinach, it's 263 micrograms per cooked cup. So you're eating a lot of greens and a lot of beans, and some people have sensitive guts and really can't tolerate that much.
Okay. And can you get folate from other sources? I know like organ meats are rich in lots of different nutrients, those types of
Yes,
things.
you can. It's just smaller amounts. Like oranges have folate. Yes, most foods have some folate, and then these are just the best sources. Liver does have a lot of most vitamins in it, which is true, including folate. However, liver also is high in other things, cholesterol, saturated fat. So depending on the woman's lipid profile, I may or may not recommend that she actually eat liver.
Oh, okay. And so maybe you talk a little bit about what we need to be looking for in a supplement to ensure that we're getting the correct methylated version of folate that is not going to be contributing to this problem.
Yes, that's a very good question. Okay, so you want to be looking, and there's not a lot on the market, by the way, but you want to be looking for something called 5-MTHF, which stands for 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. And the label will say that 5-MTHF, or it may spell it out. And then the other compound that's acceptable is folinic acid.
Okay.
So those are the two things you want in your prenatal supplement. You want 5-MTHF and folinic acid, not folic acid. And it's only off by an N. Folinic and not folic. So you have to read labels very carefully. And sometimes it's tricky because some of the prenatal vitamins will say this is made from folate, but there's really not that many that are. So I always encourage my clients to call the manufacturer and ask them, does this product contain folic acid? And that's a yes or no question. So actually there's two brands I recommend for pregnant women. And one is Seeking Health. There's a naturopath, Dr. Ben Lynch, who makes a lot of products for people that have MTHFR. Mm-hmm. And he makes a very good prenatal. And then a company called Thorne, THORNE, also makes a prenatal that's appropriate for people with MTHFR.
Okay. And so, a lot of women listening to this episode now, some of them may have been struggling with various fertility issues and may now want to run out and get themselves tested. So is it necessary? Maybe you could talk a little more specifically about what test it is. Is it necessary to run out and test, or in what situation should you go out and test?
Well, that's a good question. If it were me and if I was struggling to get pregnant, I would want to make sure that my physician had run the test. So I would start by asking their doctor, have you tested me for the MTHFR gene mutation?
Okay.
And if they haven't, then I would just ask the physician to order it, because that's easy, it's quick, you get the results in a few days, you don't have to wait a month. And if they have infertility, I believe most insurances do cover that. I don't know for sure, but certainly insurance, it seems to me, would be more likely to cover it if a woman has a history of infertility.
Okay. And then is there, because you mentioned that, of course, you found out that you had this gene mutation that sparked you to look into it further, and obviously to gain a lot more knowledge about it, to be able to help your patients who also have this gene mutation. But is there kind of an overarching message for all of us in this, or do you think that we should only really be concerned if we happen to have it?
Well, I think most people should know their status. I think that I live and work in California, and the doctors here are pretty progressive. And most of my clients who go to what are called concierge doctors, the concierge doctors are testing for it. Because here's the reason. If you have this gene mutation, you're more likely to get heart disease at a young age. So these doctors aren't thinking about it from a fertility standpoint, but rather they're thinking about, okay, my patient has high cholesterol and he's 50, and I'm trying to decide if I want to put him on a statin. So they run the test to see if the person's at risk for inflammation, because if you have this gene mutation, it also increases your risk of inflammation in your arteries. So I find a lot of my clients coming in have already been tested for it, even though they're not coming to me for fertility or anything else like that. They're coming in for weight loss or diabetes or high cholesterol. When I look at their lab work, the doctor's already ordered it.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So it's actually very common here that people have already had the test run, but sometimes the docs have talked to them about it, and sometimes they haven't. So, and certainly not in enough detail. So I always bring it up with them and go through what it means, and I do the family history, and then I look at what vitamins they're taking, educate them about the lifestyle they want to have if they have the mutation, which is one where you minimize toxins, so you don't smoke, you minimize alcohol, you make sure you're drinking purified or filtered water. You really limit your exposure to toxins. You don't want to be in an environment where you're working if there's a lot of toxins in your environment, because your body isn't able to detoxify like it should.
Okay. And something that you mentioned that if you have this gene mutation, you have an increased risk of heart disease. And I thought maybe I'd ask you to expand on that a little bit as to how this mutation impacts your heart.
Well, it's interesting. One of the first times I heard about it was about over 10 years ago, probably 12 years ago. And my friend's husband had had a heart attack at age 50, and he was a runner. He was in excellent shape, yet he had a heart attack. And it so happened that one of the top experts in the country was at the hospital here in California where he was taken. And the doctor said, I think you should test him for the MTHFR gene mutation because he has no other risk factors. He has normal cholesterol. He's not overweight. Everything looks good. And when they tested him, of course, it came back positive. And what we believe that it does is that it causes inflammation in the body. So because you're not detoxifying, because your pathways aren't working properly, inflammation builds up. And also homocysteine causes inflammation. So homocysteine causes inflammation in your arteries, so that even if your cholesterol is normal, the cholesterol going through there sticks to the arteries, and then you get plaque, and then you get heart disease in people who really shouldn't have it.
Okay, and this is all part to do with the fact that your body is not able to properly detoxify. Not only is there a buildup of homocysteine because you can't break it down, but also because that means that you're not making enough glutathione, you're not actually detoxifying your body.
Exactly.
So then, is there any way to improve your body's ability to detoxify if you have this gene mutation?
Yes, yes. You can work with a practitioner who will look at your mutations and give you supplements, because what happens is there are blocks in the pathway where you should be able to make B12, but you can't. So we might, give B12 supplements. We use vitamin B6. We use the minerals, zinc, magnesium. We use methylfolate. We use folinic acid. So we do the pathway and we look at where the blockages are. And then we also look at lifestyle, and we look at lab work and symptoms. So we don't ever just only look at the genetic profiling, but we look at the whole picture.
Okay.
And we target our recommendations based on the person's symptoms. So if I have a patient coming in who has chronic fatigue, who has this mutation, I know it's probably expressing, and I will recommend certain supplements. Yet I may have another person come in who has the gene but is in perfectly good health. I'm not going to, and I'll look at their labs, and if it suggests that there's no problem, the gene may not be expressing, because just because you have a gene doesn't mean it's expressing.
Okay. Well, and you mentioned B vitamins, B12, B6. So does having this gene mutation impair your ability to absorb those nutrients?
It can indirectly. What happens with it is this mutation can affect your gut, and that can affect your ability to absorb any nutrients.
Wow. Well, and of course, coming from the perspective of fertility and healthy babies, obviously B12, all the B vitamins are, including folate. Folate's a B vitamin, right? Is it B9?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes, B9.
So all of these, if your body isn't able to properly utilize and absorb, create, break down all of these nutrients, then that can have a significant impact on your developing baby, obviously, and your ability to conceive. So that in of itself, because a lot of people have a B12 deficiency, even though they're eating meat and
Yes,
living
exactly.
life.
Yeah, so you can have, yeah, B12 deficiency is common, and this is one of the reasons people have it. But people think drugs like Zantac or Prevacid or Prilosec, which also impair your body's ability to absorb B12. So it can also, some people are taking those meds, and we actually recommend that people who have this mutation not take those medications.
What are those types of medications for? I'm not familiar with them.
It's when you have too much acid in your stomach or you have reflux.
So that's kind of ironic. So you have a digestive type issue, and then you're taking this medication that prevents you from being able to absorb nutrients. Great.
Exactly. Yes, and not only it's the B vitamins, but minerals as well, like calcium, iron, zinc are malabsorbed. So people get other problems like osteoporosis, dental problems. Magnesium isn't well absorbed. It can affect their heart. So you really have to look at the big picture of what the person's symptoms are, what their labs are, what their genes are, and what their lifestyle is. That's why you need someone that's had training and that has a functional approach and that really knows what they're doing to help you sift through it, because it's a lot of information, and it's the biochemistry part is actually quite technical. But when you look at just breaking it down into those four things, which is your genes, your lifestyle, your labs, and your symptoms, that helps the practitioner figure out, okay, what do I do to help this person? And some people need a lot of help. Some people need a little help. Some people are doing fine, which means the gene is not turned on.
Well, and I've had a number of different people on the show from a number of different perspectives, and one of the topics that comes up every now and then is how a vegetarian or vegan diet can impact your fertility, either positively or negatively. And on the podcast so far with the guests I've had, it kind of has skeered on the side of it could potentially affect your fertility negatively. That's generally how it's been discussed. And so, in light of everything we just talked about, if you have this potentially decreased ability to absorb certain nutrients, have you had clients that have this mutation and are on a vegetarian or vegan diet? And if so, how does that particular diet fare with this gene mutation?
That's an interesting question. I don't think I've had anybody who's been vegan or vegetarian. I mean, some of my clients are like lacto-peso vegetarian, meaning they use dairy products and fish, but they just don't eat red meat. So you have to define vegetarianism. Do you mean veganism, or do you mean just sort of like more of a lightweight vegetarianism?
Well, I guess either or, because even if you're pesca lacto, I don't know if I'm
Lacto-pesco,
lacto
right?
pesco, pesca, then you're still not eating. Obviously, you're not eating organ meats, and you're not
No,
eating any red
no,
meats or any of
red
those
meat,
types of
no.
things.
Right, and actually red meat is very high in iron. It's actually the best source of iron in the diet. So, and iron's also an issue with this mutation. So, most of my clients actually who come in who want to get pregnant are not doing anything extreme with diet. They're actually eating pretty balanced, and they know they need red meat for the iron. So actually, I haven't come across that, which is interesting now that you mention it, given that I work in California. But so far, I haven't seen that. I think when women, I have plenty of other patients in the past who've been vegetarian and have very bad nutrient deficiencies, but they're not trying to get pregnant.
Okay. All right. Well, that's I guess something to explore maybe in a different podcast interview, because I'm curious now as to how that could potentially impact. But you did mention that the gene mutation can have an impact on iron. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, iron is involved in one of the pathways that has to be working properly. So a lot of times people with the gene mutation are deficient in iron because the pathway where where it actually gets utilized isn't working. So it's involved in one of the biochemical pathways.
Okay. And well, I just had a baby, and my son is 2 months old, and so it's on my radar. But so I'm just more hyper aware at this exact moment in time of how much iron your body uses when you are trying to get pregnant, when your body's building a tiny human inside of you.
Mm-hmm.
And so then if you have a patient with this gene mutation and they are low in iron, how do you counsel them to help to improve their iron levels?
Generally, I actually have them take iron supplementation because you can't rely usually on only diet. So many people have gut issues where their gut isn't working properly and the iron isn't well absorbed from food. And you'd have to eat a lot of it sometimes to get enough, and women just don't do that. So usually the OB will generally have patients on a supplement with iron, and we also sometimes recommend extra iron in another supplement form as well. So it depends. I mean, most women here are screened for iron deficiency when they get pregnant. And actually, a lot of my clients have iron deficiency just in general. It's actually very common in my practice that my female patients have iron deficiency. And I do screen all my clients for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, on a personal note, I would have, if I was your patient, I would have been on that chart of iron deficiency, because I had iron deficiency for a very long time. It was a consistent issue for me. And I actually didn't notice much of a change until I started trying to get more iron by eating more liver and all that type of stuff. Is there a particular type of iron supplement that a patient would want to look for? Is there a difference when it comes to iron supplementation?
Well, one thing you have to be careful about is if they give you prescription iron, sometimes it contains folic acid. So you
Lovely.
want to make sure that if your doctor's writing you a prescription, that it's only iron and that there's no folic acid in it.
Wow.
So you can get it prescription or you can get it over the counter. There's a product I like. It's called Solgar Gentle Iron. It's spelled Solgar, and it's easy on the gut. And Thorne also makes an iron product that I like. It's the same form of iron, and it's also easy on the gut. So I just try to pick iron supplements that don't cause constipation and that are easy on the gut. And then depending on the level, I tell the client how many pills they need to take per day.
Okay, that is a lot of information. I know you mentioned earlier that if you have a client who has this mutation, it's best to work with a functional health practitioner to look at their whole self, to test them.
Yes.
Obviously, because it's not just about the mutation, it's also about their diet, their lifestyle, their stress levels, everything. Mm-hmm. And it is a lot of information. This gene mutation has been on my radar for a while, just because of how significantly it can impact women at this time when they're trying to have babies. And I believe that I knew that it impaired your ability to utilize folic acid. But what I didn't know is how negatively having that folic acid in your diet could affect you. So I kind of thought, okay, well, you just replace it with folate. But I didn't realize you should also be removing the folic acid from the equation because of the negative impacts that can have. And I don't think I realized how many other nutrients can be impacted by this gene mutation as well.
Yes, that's true. In fact, Dr. Lynch, who I consider to be the top expert in the field for MTHFR, says that folic acid is absorbed and then it blocks the folate receptors and the body cannot utilize it. So another aspect is that having folic acid there actually prevents you from utilizing folate that you're eating. So if you take folic acid or eat folic acid and you happen to eat folate-rich foods, it doesn't get utilized because the folic acid is in the way.
That's the scariest thing ever from the perspective of a woman who's trying to conceive.
It is scary, Lisa. I agree with you. And I have to say, though, that most of my clients who see infertility doctors out here in California are getting tested for it. But so I would hope that, the infertility doctors have it on their radar. But honestly, I don't know in other states what's happening. And I know sometimes in other states that the healthcare can be variable depending on where the person lives, if they're in a small town. So I think it's important that consumers educate themselves nowadays about what we need.
Well, absolutely. And I live in Canada, and be honest, I live in Toronto,
I didn't
Ontario.
realize that.
But I'm not too sure, what it's going like. Hopefully it's a common thing that's being screened everywhere. But I don't necessarily have a reason to believe that your typical garden variety physician is doing all of these tests unless you've come in with a very specific issue that would trigger this.
Yes, like for example, having multiple miscarriages or having, having had another child that had a birth defect like cleft palate or spina bifida, things like that might trigger for them. But in Canada, I have no idea where they're at with this. I have no idea.
And the advice from my physician wasn't to look for a supplement with, 5-MTP?
5-MTHF, yes, methylfolate, 5-MTHF.
Yes, my recommendation was to make sure I'm getting enough folic acid.
Yeah, that's still common. I do read articles in our journals, the medical journals here, that say folic acid is okay, but based on what I've learned and what Dr. Lynch is spending his career, dedicating his career to teaching people, and he's training health professionals all over the US, it's just wrong information. It's like new information. You have to let go of the past. You have to say, okay, in people that have this gene, folic acid is not okay for them. If you don't have the gene, it's fine. But if you have it, why would you not be proactive about helping this person have the healthiest baby and the healthiest body and life that they can have?
Well, and at the beginning of the podcast, when I asked you how prevalent it is, it sounds like it varies depending on what type of mutation the person has specifically, and what ethnicity. And but with that being said, there's a significant percentage of the population that has some form of this gene mutation. So if you're going from the perspective of first do no harm, then it would seem to me that the folic acid shouldn't be what is fortified in all the food, or it shouldn't be the standard. It would seem to me that the methylated version should be the standard, because it does obviously do harm to those that have this gene mutation, and most people are not. I think I can make the statement that most people are not screened for this.
I agree
in the world.
Yes. Yeah, in the world, yes. And Dr. Lynch actually believes that folic acid should not exist in the food supply or in vitamins at all. And he says everybody should avoid folic acid because what you're saying, some people aren't able to get tested. And there's no reason to take it. I mean, methylfolate is what your body needs. So why take something that your body has to convert through multiple reactions to get to the active form?
And it's definitely misinformation then to tell women the folic acid, because you would never know unless you happen to hear a podcast about the MTHFR gene mutation. You're not really going to, or unless it's been brought to your attention by your physician, you wouldn't really know. How would you know?
Exactly. And hopefully over time, this message will get through to all the health professionals. It's just people that are more like functional medicinely trained, like the functional medicine doctors, functional nutritionists, we're aware of it, but more the mainstream Western medical physicians, I think, are less aware of it.
Okay. Well, one of the things that you had mentioned, going through the list of symptoms that could be related to this defect, you mentioned something that I wouldn't have necessarily thought of. You mentioned depression and anxiety. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the link to that. How could this gene mutation, increase your chances of having depression or anxiety?
Okay. Well, it's more common with, actually, depression occurs with both mutations, but more the neurological, psychological piece is more common with the 1298 mutation. And the reason is that when you have 1298, your body is not able to make a product called biopterin. And biopterin is a precursor for norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, which are the main chemicals in the brain that regulate your mood.
Okay. So then you're not making the precursor to those hormones that make you not depressed.
The neurotransmitters, exactly, yes.
I'm obviously not a physician, so.
You're doing very well.
Thanks.
Trust me, with the science part, you get an A+.
Thanks. That's sweet.
So yes, it's a whole other part of the body. So we're not talking about the uterus, we're not talking about making babies, we're talking about the brain. And so if you have this mutation, it prevents, again, another pathway from working properly. And the pathway where you make your neurochemicals that make you happy and make you feel content and help you sleep is disrupted. And this particular pathway, people need some methylfolate. And then they also need extra minerals and vitamins and things that aren't being processed properly. So that's a whole nother piece of it. So it depends on what mutation you have as to what recommendations we make. But generally with 1298, you're going to see more problems with the depression, anxiety, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, irritable bowel syndrome. And I do have clients coming in with those diagnoses who do have the mutation. So I'm definitely seeing that. This isn't the research, but I'm also seeing it in my practice.
And irritable bowel, what's the connection there? Same.
Serotonin. Yes, serotonin. Serotonin regulates your gut. So if you don't make enough, you get irritable bowel. And then also, if you're not detoxifying toxins, that irritates your gut and causes symptoms as well.
So then, because you did say earlier that it impacts your gut, and then you
It
talked about
does.
how it impacts your ability to absorb nutrients, and that is a very wide-reaching. I think that's why I keep seeing it. I didn't really know what it was the first few times that I saw this MTHFR, other than it kind of looks like a swear word.
Yes, it does.
So
You're
I was
right.
like, what are they talking about? But that's why I keep seeing it, because it's not just one thing. That is pretty wild. The range of medical issues that it can cause, or at least make worse,
Yes.
from inability to absorb nutrients to miscarriages to blood clots, heart disease, stroke, birth defects, depression, and irritable bowel. Those things are surprising to me, because I didn't know the wide range of medical conditions that were impacted by this.
One way to look at it, Lisa, is to remember that folate is essential for every cell in your body. It does many things, and it's super important. So if people aren't making the methylfolate, really every system in their body is affected by it. The brain, the gut, the heart, your immune system, everything's affected. Hormones.
Well, and the interesting thing is that the only time you ever hear about folate is with regards to pregnant women. And I think
You're
that
right.
is why this is kind of blowing my mind right now, you because I'm not a geneticist and I'm not a doctor. Obviously, I did not get my degree in nutritional science yet. There's always a future. But yeah, I didn't know the far-reaching impacts of folate on the body. So this is obviously not just an issue for women, but an issue for men as well.
It is. It is. And I do want to say one thing that you referred to, which is that I also am not a medical doctor, and the information I'm giving is not intended to be medical advice.
Oh yeah, absolutely. This podcast has never been intended to give medical advice. It's more just to provide information and
Okay.
a starting point for women in their knowledge. I like to interview guests on various topics just to provide that information, so that you can have a place to go. So when you go to your physician, you have something to ask about, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe
Mm-hmm.
something's on your radar. So I'm glad that you mentioned that.
And to answer your question about men, actually, I consulted with Dr. Lynch about this because I wasn't sure. I couldn't find anything in the research about it, but he agreed, same opinion I had, which is that if you study genetics, the way genetics work, we have no reason to think that it would be any different in women or men. But what is different is turning the gene on. So women have more factors that turn the gene on than men do, I believe. For example, we have estrogen and not testosterone. And estrogen turns on certain genes. And so what I'm seeing is in my practice that more people coming in with this issue are women, not men. I have a few men, but I have many more women.
Mm-hmm.
And just in general, women are more prone to depression. They're more prone to gut issues because we already have less serotonin in our bodies than men do to begin with. So a man may have the gene, but he has enough serotonin that he's not very symptomatic. So he gets IBS once in a while, but he just figures, that's life. And men actually don't go to the doctor as much as women anyway, in my experience. So a man could have it for many years and not know until he has a heart attack.
Wow. And something that you mentioned, because I think it just slipped my mind. It might come back to me. It was good though.
It'll come back. Keep talking, it'll come back.
Well, I think we've gone through so much of what I wanted to talk about, and I think I'm having a moment where I'm just like, people really need to know about this, and I'm really glad that I did this podcast, because it went a lot. I think what happened is it went far beyond my little focus on fertility into this whole body focus, and this wide-reaching impact. So, I mean, given that folic acid is in the food supply, it's not going anywhere, at least right now. Should
Right.
we be scared? Like, because one of the things that I find is that when you focus in on a certain topic, you can really get in there, you learn all this information, all of a sudden you're scared of everything. You're scared of bread now, you're scared of almond milk, you're scared of everything. You were eating a protein bar, and now you threw it across the room because you're so terrified. So that our listeners don't leave feeling like, oh my goodness, I can never eat a bagel again. What do you usually advise your clients when you kind of get to the gravity of the situation, so that they're not feeling so overwhelmed by this knowledge?
That's a really good question because, this absolutely is overwhelming, which is why I always recommend that people consult with a practitioner to interpret if they're going to do the genetic testing. It's really hard to interpret yourself. So definitely work with someone that can help you so that you don't feel overwhelmed. But, you can get almond milk that has no folic acid in it. And you can get protein bars that don't have folic acid. That's the good news. You just have to read labels and find them. And you might have to buy some online if your local grocery stores or health food stores don't carry it. But also everything in balance. I always tell my clients, you know what, eat healthy 80% of the time. If 20% of the time you want to eat stuff that has folic acid, it's not going to kill you. It's not black and white.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good balance, kind of the 80-20 rule. So
Yeah.
being mindful of it, but not being OCD about it, because that's not
Exactly.
healthy. That would just cause more stress, and obviously stress is going to cause other problems.
Exactly. That's really true. Stress is bad for you as well. So if you're out and you have no choice but to eat a bagel with folic acid, it's not going to kill you. You can have the bagel, but you might want to think about, do I want to eat a bagel every single day for breakfast? Maybe not. Maybe change it up. Maybe have a bagel one day a week, and on the other days have something like oatmeal, that's, by the way, oatmeal typically does not have folic acid added to it. So, find some hot cereals or find other breakfast foods that don't have the folic acid added. Eggs have no folic acid. Dairy products, they don't add folic acid to. So it's not that hard to do, actually, but it does take a little bit of thought, I guess.
And I liked what you said, that if you avoid processed food for the most part and eat real whole foods, fresh foods, then it's really not that big of an issue. So that's a good guideline as well.
Right.
And so I have a few questions I'd usually end the show with. But before we do that, I would love for you to give some parting information for women who are listening who may be struggling with fertility issues, kind of the summary takeaways from all of this, because you definitely have given us a lot to think about, and that was a lot of information. So any takeaways then for any women who are listening? Maybe they're not even trying yet to get pregnant, but it's on their radar in the next little while.
Sure. I would encourage you to try to find out your MTHFR status, whether you can get your physician to order it or if you want to do it through 23andMe. There might be other online testing programs as well where you can order it yourself. I would encourage women to go into pregnancy with the idea that the least amount of stress is the best. So don't get overly focused on, if you do have the gene, don't get overly crazy about what you're eating and what you're doing, because that doesn't help. And if you have the gene, minimum is just to take a prenatal that does not have folic acid in it, and try to minimize your consumption of processed foods, which is good advice for everybody, no matter what their gene status. And stress does turn on genes. The other piece about this is the term epigenetics, which refers to what in our environments turns genes on and off. And stress is a big turner-oner of genes. So I always work with all my clients to try to have as low of a stress lifestyle as they can and to actively do things to relax, meditation, yoga, relaxation breathing, not to overschedule yourself. Those things are just as important as what you eat.
Okay, and that reminds me of that question that I had that I couldn't remember.
Right.
And so you mentioned that earlier, that some people have the gene, some of your clients would have this gene, but maybe their symptoms aren't that bad. So when you test for it, does it just tell you that you have the gene, or is it possible to
Yes.
tell if it's on or off? Probably not.
No, but a practitioner usually can tell that. It depends on what's going on with your labs and your symptoms.
Okay, so it's possible then for someone to test positive for this gene and not necessarily be having this dire impact on their life.
Exactly. I'll give you an example. I've had the gene my whole life, but I didn't have symptoms till my 30s.
And then others would have had symptoms all along and then just maybe,
Yes.
okay.
Yes. And that depends on what turns on the gene in your environment. So different things turn it on. So yeah, I have people, there's kids I know of that have the gene and they already are symptomatic. And then I have a man I saw like in his 60s who is actually very healthy and has the gene, but he lives in Italy most of the time. And so it's very different over there. They don't have processed food. They exercise. They have low stress. So he's having minimal effects from it.
That's really interesting. And I did have a guest on the show where we talked a little bit about genes and how they're not necessarily like a sentence, like a death sentence.
No,
If you have
no.
a gene, it's good to know if you have the gene and know what it could mean for you. But obviously, several people could have the same gene and have a completely different expression of it.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Oh, well, I feel so much better that I remembered the question because, like I said, it was good. And I
That's
was
a very
curious
good
about
question.
that.
Yes, and it's a good point. So that just be like I have the gene, but I don't worry that I'm going to die tomorrow. I mean, because I know I'm doing what I need to do to take care of it. So, and actually, I feel much better now that I know I have it because I've made changes with my vitamins that make my quality of life much better.
Hmm. Well, so I have a few questions then to end the show. What would you say is the most important thing that a woman should know when she's trying to get pregnant?
Well, probably to avoid folic acid, because assuming that there's a probably an 80% chance that you have some form of the mutation, I would say avoiding folic acid, avoiding toxins like cigarette smoke, alcohol, chemical exposure, be careful with cleaning products, and then try to eat whole foods most of the time.
Okay. What would you say is the biggest myth about fertility that you'd like to see corrected?
That's a good question. Well, I guess that folic acid is good for you. I don't. I don't know. I don't hear a lot of fertility myths out here in California. People out here are pretty straightforward.
That
Did you
is a
have
great
particular?
one, I have to say. And you were the first person to say that. And it's so true.
Yes, I would have to say the folic acid piece about everyone, all the doctors pushing folic acid on women who might have the mutation and don't know it, and especially if they've had multiple miscarriages or children with birth defects.
Ah, yes, absolutely. And final question, we didn't touch on the pill at all today, but this is a question that I tend to ask most of my guests. So, for a woman listening who's currently on the pill, she doesn't want to get pregnant now, but she's thinking maybe about getting pregnant in the next 2 to 3 years. What advice, if any, would you give to her?
Well, that's a very good question because birth control pills deplete the body of folate. So I would say get on a prenatal supplement that has methylfolate in it.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate you for taking the time to share your knowledge and your experience. I feel like I have learned so much from you, and I can't wait to share our interview with the listeners. And so, any of the listeners who happen to live in the California area who would like to work with you, or if they just want to find out more about what you do, how can they get in touch with you?
And they can go to my website, which is diannekeddy.com.
Okay, and I'll make sure to link that on the show notes page, of course. So thanks again, Dianne. I had a great time talking with you today.
Thank you very much, Lisa. It was my pleasure.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. I'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, so head over to the show notes page for today's episode, which you'll find at fertilityfriday.com/54, so the number 54, and let me know what you found most interesting, most surprising. I would love to hear your thoughts on this show today. And if you've been enjoying the podcast, please look for it on iTunes and leave a 5-star review so that more people can find it. And also, if you have an idea for a podcast episode or a guest suggestion, just shoot me an email at info@fertilityfriday.com. And I appreciate all of you for taking the time to tune into the podcast and supporting the show, whatever you're doing, whether you're commuting to work or just going for a walk or whatever it is you're doing. So thanks again. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.